right, Tatiana, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you as well. I'm so excited to have a Latina who's in the mental health space and who's really doing work out here to help others through your lived experiences. But before we even get into your story, I would love for you to introduce yourself for anyone who's meeting you for the first time, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Tatiana. I am, of course, like you said, a Latina trauma and somatic therapist. I'm also a holistic coach. So I specialize in helping women regulate and rewire their nervous systems through a holistic lens, and also a method called somatic experiencing, which is a body oriented approach to healing trauma. And it's a method where we are working directly with the nervous system. We don't have to talk about your trauma or even remember your trauma to heal from it.
Yes, and I'm really excited that we're going to talk about that aspect of healing because there's so many different ways that one can heal from what they've gone through. I think a lot of people think about therapy and it's just them going to into an office and just talking out the things that they've gone through, but there's so many more holistic ways like you talked about when it comes to healing from the trauma that you've gone through. So, I always like to start off with my guests who come on to paint a picture about what life looked like for you prior to you getting into this work. I know you're someone who has dealt with complex trauma, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about what those experiences were and then transition into what made you decide to really want to start doing this work to help others with the things that you've gone through in your past.
1000%. And I just want to thank you for having this platform because I think that it's so important to hear people's stories. And I think, especially when we see people who are successful and who are in the mental health field, especially, we forget that they're humans and we forget that they've also have probably lived experience, right? And for me, I came into the field because I am a complex trauma survivor. I've lived in survival mode as early as 5 or 6 years old. I also have generational trauma like most of us do. And I had very emotionally unavailable parents. And it's hard, right? Because my parents are immigrants and my parents love me so much. And because of their unresolved trauma, they were emotionally unavailable and emotionally immature. And that really hurt my nervous system. It really resulted in creating or me developing trauma responses. I had very little self-esteem. I was very anxious as a child. I was so anxious that I remember I was almost like selectively mute. So whenever I was in a social setting and my parents would be like, oh, say hi, whatever, talk to this person, I would become mute. And it wasn't something that I could control, but people really brushed it off as like, oh, she's shy or oh, she's just like that. And it started getting worse and worse. I remember I had a lot of physical symptoms. So I had really bad stomach aches for years. And I got blood tests done, and no doctor could really figure out what was going on with me. And my parents really thought that I was just kind of like making it up. It was something that I was doing to get out of certain situations like eating, going to school, things like that. And I really struggled with that because I felt like, am I making it up? Right? As a kid, you don't really know what's going on. And it turns out I just had really chronic anxiety. My nervous system was in this sympathetic state of activation all of the time. And it was hard because my parents were kind of like hot and cold. They were very loving. They would give everything to you. And then it was almost like nothing. And so I had all of this love and then no love at all, to the point where I was like, I don't know, getting ignored sometimes. I would be left crying, and it's hard to talk about those things, but I think it's also really important to share them to understand how I got into an abusive relationship, because this all led to being in a very abusive and toxic relationship in high school and he was really the only person who really showed me attention and love, right? And when you have really chronic anxiety, when you have really low self esteem, and somebody shows you all of this love and they're kind of like love bombing you, and then all of a sudden they're being cold, right? It's kind of like that hot and cold that my parents were showing me, right? It was normal. It was very normal for me. I was very used to being in this toxic and chaotic environment. And being in a toxic relationship didn't seem any different. And there was a part of me that knew that there was something wrong about this, right? I think we all have this inner knowing. But again, when we have trauma, when we have unresolved wounds, it can be really difficult to trust that inner knowing, that intuition that we all have, right? It gets very blurry. And so even though logically I knew that there was something wrong, I probably shouldn't be in this relationship, it was really difficult to break out of that. And at that point, when I maybe wanted to get out of it, I didn't have any friends left. And so he was my person. He was the only person that I felt supported by. And again, it was like, it was really toxic because even though he was the only person that I felt quote unquote safe with, he was also the person that was probably doing the most damage at that point.
And also to think about it, like you were in high school when you met this person. So, of course, you're very young, you're very naive, you're very impressionable. You're used to the things that you went through in childhood, and that familiarity is safe. It feels safe for you because you know what to expect. You're used to the chaos, you're used to the hot and cold like you talked about before. I'm just thinking about my own relationship as well. Like I was in an abusive relationship too later on in life in my early 30s. And I remember a time before the physical abuse started with that relationship, my body was telling me, sis, this ain't it. Like I'm telling you, Tatiana, there was a point in time in my relationship, I woke up fucking sick every single day. The stomach aches that you talked about, the headaches, that anxious feeling. I know now that I was living in that survival mode. I was in that fight or flight without even knowing it. But it's so interesting to me how our bodies are really trying to tell us something, but when you're used to the chaos, when you're living in this and it's something that you've dealt with over and over, you tend to not listen to that voice until sometimes it's life or death. That's what it was for me. I decided to finally listen to the intuition when my ex almost tried to kill me.
Yeah, 1000%. And I think that I was in a life or death situation at one point, and I wasn't in this state of sympathetic activation. I wasn't in fight or flight. I was actually in freeze. And so for me, I was like, okay, so I remember I was in this life or death situation. And then the next day, I remember he was apologizing, sending me all of these texts. And then I was just like, okay. I was like, fine, that's fine. Because I was so numb. I was so physically and emotionally numb. So in this fight or flight, right, like we can experience all of these symptoms, but when you're in freeze, you don't feel anything. And it was so normal to me that I was just like, okay, yeah. And then I continued to be in the relationship because it no longer was affecting me. And I didn't feel anything at all, which is probably one of the worst things, to not feel anything. So I stayed in this relationship for about 4 years. And it wasn't until I got to college that I had that separation and I was able to kind of have that freedom. And I was meeting new people that I was like, oh, I can get away. And it kind of started to open my eyes a little bit, and I got the courage, and really I had enough capacity in my system to be like, yeah, you know what? I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, because at that point I started, like I said, I was building relationships. So now I had friends to lean on, which I didn't have in high school. I guess I had like acquaintances in high school, but nobody actually knew what was going on in my relationship. And so I didn't really have a support system. And then in college, I kind of felt like I had a support system. And I was like, okay, now I feel brave enough. I feel secure enough that I can end this relationship. And again, there was more physical distance between us where I said, okay, now I can get away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to know, once you got to college, is that when you entered into the mental health space, and is that when you started your journey? How did your journey of healing look like? And then how did you get into the work that you do today?
Sure. So to rewind a little bit, before I got to college, in high school, I was experiencing a lot of symptoms of depression. And so there were moments in my life where I wanted to complete suicide. And so I remember just feeling so low. There was so much going on in my life that nobody really knew about. I had begged my parents to take me to therapy, and in the Hispanic and the Latino community, mental health isn't really talked about enough. My parents quite literally said I was crazy, and they did not take me to get the services that I needed. And it was really difficult because I just didn't have any support at all. And I remember saying to myself, like, I never, ever, ever want to make anyone feel the way that I felt growing up. Like, I had nobody. And from the outside in, my life was good, right? Like, on the outside, people didn't know what was going on, right? Like, people can put on good fronts, and nobody actually knew what was happening for me at home or internally. And so that was difficult too, because I had to constantly mask, right? And so I went into college wanting to help people, especially the people who kind of look like they have it all together. I really wanted to help those people never feel that way. Like, I wanted them to feel like they had support, like, you can move forward. So that's how I got into the world of psychology. And then I struggled significantly in school. Elementary school, middle school, high school. I struggled significantly. College was even worse. I failed Psychology 101 3 times. And I like telling that story. I like telling people that I failed Psychology 101 because here I am. I'm a therapist. I'm also a holistic coach, and I am in the mental health field, right? And I think that sometimes we get really discouraged when we feel like things are difficult, or things like we fail a class. Oh, it's not meant for me, right? I failed 3 times, and I was like, no, I am going to do this. And I kept going. After maybe my sophomore year, I started taking things a little bit more seriously. I had some friendships that didn't last, and so there were disruptions in my friendships that really kind of helped me focus more on school, because I wasn't partying as much, I wasn't drinking as much. I was like, all right, now I need to focus on something. I need to put my energy on something. And then that's when I started to focus more on school. That was my junior year. And then once I started taking school more seriously, I was like, wow, I really love learning about the brain and psychology. I took a human development class, and I absolutely loved it. So I ended up double majoring. So I got 2 bachelor's degrees in psychology, in human development, family studies. And by that point, my junior and senior year, I was like, I definitely want to be a therapist. And then I applied to graduate school. I got into a master's program to get my master's in mental health counseling. And throughout this entire time, I was still living in survival mode. I still had never gone to therapy at this point in my life. I only started going to therapy after I graduated from grad school. And so my nervous system was chronically dysregulated. I was on medication for anxiety, for depression, and I struggled significantly with just the process of being in grad school. And then once I graduated, I was like, all right, you know what? It's time to go into therapy. It's time to do some healing. And I started talk therapy. I tried some different modalities: talk therapy, CBT, EMDR, internal family systems. I meditated. I read self-help books, and I was still living in survival mode. Nothing was working. I knew all the things intellectually. I had all the skills logically. I studied to be a therapist. I knew what to do. So why wasn't I healed? Why was I still feeling the way that I was feeling? I was constantly dissociating, constantly feeling like I was in a dream, having out of body experiences. a lot of social anxiety. And then 2020 came. And at this point, so I had worked in community mental health for 4 years. And after that, I was working from home during 2020. And then that's when I started to feel so burnt out and unfulfilled with my life because I was in community mental health. I was go, 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 right? Overstimulation constantly in this contributing that to that cycle of fight or flight, right? Of survival mode. And in 2020, we all had to slow down. And my nervous system didn't have the capacity for it. It couldn't handle it. So I was starting to feel unfulfilled. I told my supervisor at the time, I was like, I don't even know if I want to be a therapist anymore. I wasn't enjoying what I was doing. And then she was like, you know what? Maybe you just need to do a training. Maybe you just need inspiration. So I was like, fine, let me find inspiration. And then I came across somatic experiencing and I decided to apply to the program without even thinking twice about it. I was just like, all right, well, this sounds cool. I didn't know what it was. And I signed up and it changed my life. It absolutely changed my life because no longer was I trying to intellectualize my way through trauma. I was really working with my nervous system. Part of the program requires you to do your own somatic experiencing sessions. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, there's a way out. I thought this was going to be my life forever. I thought I was going to be living in survival mode forever. And that's how I started healing my nervous system.
I love that so much. And I love that it's a different approach. I love that you shared that you try all these other things and they didn't work out, but you didn't give up. I think it's so easy, like you said before, failing the class 3 times and you could have just said, this isn't for me. But you had that determination in you to be like, I know there's something out there for me. And I really want people to remember that just because something doesn't work out the first time doesn't mean that it's not for you. It doesn't mean that there's not another way for you to start healing your own trauma. So now that we're talking about the somatic healing, for someone who's hearing that for the first time, has no clue what the fuck you're talking about, if you could explain that in layman's terms, and then what are some simple exercises that someone can do on their own to get started in order to learn how to calm their nervous system?
Sure. So the word somatic just means related to the body, in relation to the body. So if you ever hear somatic yoga or somatic breath work, really, I mean, breath work and yoga are already somatic without putting the word somatic in front of it because it's already in relation to the body. So somatic experiencing is different than it really does go beyond learning somatic tools. Somatic tools is one thing, somatic experiencing is really healing your nervous system long term. So some practices that you can do to support your nervous system to help you feel a little bit more settled and connected are number one, one of my favorite practices is called the VOO sound. All you have to do is make a sound like this, VOO, and then you go until you can't breathe anymore, all the way until your breath is out. The VOO sound stimulates your vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is the primary nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that helps you rest, digest, feel calm, and connected, settled in your body. So anytime we stimulate the vagus nerve, we're going to feel, if we're in fight or flight, we're going to feel a little bit more settled and connected. If we're in freeze, we're going to feel a little bit more awake and alert. So that's the VOO sound, and you can practice that anywhere you want, every day. It doesn't matter if you're in the car, in the shower, wherever. And so that's a great one. Number 2 is something that's called a guppy breath, but it's not actually a breath work tool. All it is bringing your jaw all the way down until there's resistance. I know that you can't see me if you're listening to this podcast, but what you do is just allow your tongue to fall at the floor of your mouth, allowing some space in between your teeth, and then you just allow the jaw to drop down. and then slowly coming back up. That is going to release any tension in the jaw or your throat. So, like when we have that knot in our throat, like we feel like we're going to cry, doing that is really going to relieve that tension and that knot in your throat. Or even if you just allow movement into the jaw side to side, up and down, nice and slow. Anytime we do a somatic practice, we want to do it slowly, because if we do it too quickly, we're just contributing to fight or flight. We want to slow things down. I like to tell my clients, like, imagine you're going in super slow motion. And then number 3 are just belly breaths. So again, belly breathing activates the vagus nerve. So on the inhale, you're pushing your belly out, and on the exhale, you're bringing your belly in.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so interesting. Slowing down, I think it's very uncomfortable for a lot of people, especially if they're living in that fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. I would love for you to also explain that too, because I think talking about the nervous system is very trendy nowadays. Like, it's another buzzword that we hear a lot on social media. But you being a professional, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about those 4 different responses, and what are some common signs that you notice as a therapist and a coach of someone's nervous system being in that survival mode.
Sure. And just to clarify, the reason why I only talk about fight, flight, and freeze are because those are our physiological responses, fight, flight, freeze, versus fawning is less of a physiological response, but more of like a behavioral response, right? And so it's a learned response, versus fight, flight, freeze is physiological. I hope that makes sense for people. But so if you don't know what fawning is, it's like the people pleasing, right? So the other part of your question was signs of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So yeah, so let's start with fight. I mean, a lot of the time we think of fight as just anger, but fight can be judgment towards yourself, judgment towards others. It can also show up as irritation, getting defensive easily, resistance, and it could be like resistance to doing anything. Anytime you notice that you're resistant to something, or physical resistance, that's a good indicator that you're in a fight state. Anger, of course, having clenched fists, having tension throughout the body, burning sensations in your stomach, feelings like you want to scream, right? That's also fight. And so fight, it shows up differently for everybody. You might have the feeling in your legs of wanting to kick something. You might want to punch something, right? All of that is fight. Flight is avoidance, racing thoughts, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, OCD, sense of urgency, inability to slow down, hustle, right? When you're hustling, hustle culture, right? That's flight, racing heartbeat, high blood pressure, knots in your stomach or your throat. There are so many other signs and symptoms, but I think those are the most common ones. And then freeze is dissociation, right? Feeling disconnected from yourself, from others, feeling physically or emotionally numb, feeling like you're in a dream, zoning out. So we all kind of like dissociate, and it's on a spectrum, right? Zoning out is at the mild end of the spectrum, and then having out of body experiences is on the other side of the spectrum. Feeling like you can't take action. I know so many women who have goals and they know logically what they want to do, or they want to start a business, they want to end that relationship, they want to start school, whatever it is, right? And they know exactly what they need to do to get there, but they can't get themselves to get there. That's a good indicator that you're in a freeze state. Inability to just do your daily chores and tasks. Symptoms of depression. All of that falls under freeze. Low self-esteem, low self-confidence. That falls under freeze.
Can people have a mix of all 3?
1000%. That's a really great question. And so what happens is when you spend too much time in a state of fight or flight, automatically, eventually, you're going to fall into a state of freeze because your nervous system isn't meant to be in this constant state of fight or flight for a long period of time. So it's going to get burnt out. Burnout lives in freeze, right? And it's something that we can't control. So often I get the question of like, how do I move out of freeze, or how do I function when I'm in this freeze state? And really, we have to get to the root of it. Instead of trying to learn ways to move through the freeze state, we need to really learn ways to prevent the freeze state. So how can we go from fight or flight to a parasympathetic nervous system instead of constantly going until like stretching out your nervous system in this fight or flight state and then constantly falling into the freeze state? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I want to ask you, what is a piece of advice that you would give someone who may be in the beginning of their healing journey when it comes to trauma and they're feeling overwhelmed by the process? What are some key pieces of advice that you would tell them on how to get started?
Yeah, I love that question. So I always say start with your basic physiological needs. And that has nothing to do with quote unquote trauma, right? It has nothing to do with your emotional needs, right? Or at least most people wouldn't think that. But your basic physiological needs are sleep and food. Getting your nutrients in and getting at least 8 hours of sleep is going to significantly impact your mood and it's the overall health of your nervous system, right? I always tell my clients, we can't move out of survival mode if we're not getting enough sleep and if we're not getting nutrients in. You can have all the therapy you want, but if you are not meeting your basic needs, you're still going to be living in survival mode. And we all need at least 8 hours of sleep, but women actually need more than 8 hours of sleep. If you're not getting sleep, your nervous system is going to stay dysregulated. So that's my advice. Go back to your basic physiological needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that's something that I definitely got to work on. I'm trying to do better, but I know I'm a night owl. But just back to school is coming, so I'm going to have to go to bed a little bit earlier. I ask everyone on this podcast, what do you want the biggest takeaway to be for people who listen to your story?
The number one thing that I want people to know is that you don't have to live in survival mode for the rest of your life. I know that sometimes it feels like that's it, that's your life. There's no way out. I know what that's like. I felt like living in survival mode was the end for me. I thought that's how I had to live my life. And it's not. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. And if you're not into talk therapy, that's great because there are so many alternatives to talk therapy. You don't have to talk about your trauma to heal from it.
Yes, I love that so much, and I appreciate the wisdom that you shared. Tell me, what is your definition of thriving since you're on the Watch Us Thrive podcast?
Ah, I love that. My definition of thriving is healing your nervous system. I'm sure that's not a surprise.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, especially for our community. I love seeing Latinas who look like us, who've been through some shit, but are out here changing the world one conversation at a time. Please plug in how we can follow you, your podcast, any other last pieces of advice that you want to leave the people with.
Sure. So if you want to learn more about holistic healing, trauma healing, you can either follow me on Instagram at tatiana.holistic.coach, or you can listen to my podcast. It's called She is Resilient, and I talk all things holistic living, somatic healing, trauma healing, and also I have wonderful guests who share their vulnerable stories as well. I also have a free community where you can learn somatic tools and practices. So if you're like, I definitely want more tools to support my nervous system, come to my free community. It's every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
I love that. We're going to link all of her info in the show notes. Tatiana, again, thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to continuing following your journey and giving us a permission to know that we can heal from what we've gone through. And it all starts within.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.